Can you hear me well? Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so I'm here today with some wonderful speakers that I gathered from different corners of the world. And next to me is Dr. Devlin, who is a writer and a lecturer at the University of Huddersfield. His research explores the use of documentary imagery in relation to art practices that operate in social and political realms. And what is interesting in the context of Democracia is that he's looking at how antagonistic, socially engaged art practices are a vital force in the democratic process. Next to Liam is Dr. Emma Mahony, who works as a lecturer at the School of Visual Culture at the National College of Art and Design here in Dublin since 2009. She also works as a postdoctoral research assistant at the Royal College of Art in London and is a member of the Media, Art and Text PhD program at Virginia Commonwealth University. She was also a curator of many exhibitions, and between 2004 and 2008, she was an exhibition curator for Hayward touring at South Bank Centre in London. Next to Emma is Dr. Irene Noy, who is an art historian and the author of Emergency Noises, Sound, Art and Gender, published in 2017. And she holds a PhD from the Court of the Institute of Art, London, where she also completed her postdoctoral fellowship recently. And prior to that, she studied at University of Bonn, University of British Columbia, and University of Edinburgh. And her research explores 20th century oral and visual cultures in relation to gender and census. And finally, last but not least, Democracia. We're very pleased to have you on this panel, Pablo, España, and Iván López. As you already know from this exhibition, their work intervenes in public space, but also the image and the sound in this particular exhibition are very important. So together with the panelists, we'll help, we'll try to unpack those different layers and address different issues in this work. Hence the title of the panel, Breakpoints. And Pablo and Iván are also curators and editors of Nolan Volumes magazine and activists, very active in Spain and elsewhere. So I decided to ask our speakers here to respond, to prepare like 5-7 minutes response to the piece. So we're going to start from that and then engage in a conversation. And if there are any pending questions, or there's something that you don't understand the term or something, as we're talking, please just raise your hands. And also feel very warmly invited to ask your questions and share your thoughts, because although it looks quite, there is a distance between us, but I would rather have you involved really in this conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Liam.
Thanks very much. I'm going to respond mostly to the film, which I hope you've seen, but then I will come back and talk about the space generally that we're kind of sitting in. I do want to say, though, I heartily endorse all the sentiments sung by the Complaints Choir. But, and I have to say, having the Complaints Choir sing with a backdrop to the Black Panthers is an image that's going to stay with me, I think. It's a fascinating piece of work, and I'm not really going to talk about the structure of the film necessarily, but more about some of the questions that it raises for me, and more around where it sits within the important means to maintain a kind of a public sphere, a space to come together and talk. So we got this fascinating piece of work that conflates sort of the language of film, of opera, and also of protest. And so it's deliberately bringing these things together that are actually quite antagonistic, which I think is very, very interesting. So the questions that sort of ranged, my first sort of impression of the film was that it was a kind of just a clear declaration of inequality, of a rigged system that sells lies and segregates the haves from the have-nots. Again, it felt Baroque to me in its imagery and its quality, a kind of almost a Baroque celebration of exploitation. It's really quite emphatic. But interestingly, all of it seems to be performed in a manner that is, and I'll explain this term, inconsequential, which I think is very interesting. Making political work is a very, very difficult task, I think. It's to say I'm going to make a political piece of art is quite difficult and quite dangerous. It's like telling somebody you're going to tell them a funny joke, because chances are they're not going to laugh, all right? But it's still worth considering. I read in the notes that it was initially based on Hesiod's poem, Words and Days, which is very much a denouncement of the political environment at the time, which feels very relevant. But for me, the inconsequential aspect relates closer to satire. And it reminds me actually of Jonathan Swift's essay called A Modest Proposal, written in the 18th century, where he suggested that the Irish peasantry, the poverty established in Ireland, could be resolved by the Irish poor selling their children for food. Okay? And it was a deliberate satirical take on that particular time, and it was really sort of poking fun at the sort of the moral high ground of a lot of the sort of political elites at the time. But does this film have a message? Should it even strive to have one? I think if we consider it as a film, and my relationship was just seeing a film before I came into the gallery, I found it, for me as a film, and I'll put this in context, it feels sort of almost deliberately sort of inadequate and actually quite obtuse. For example, the film offers no possibility of redemption. There is no escape. There is no moment of resolution or transformation offered, which I think is very interesting. The film opens with some beautiful, almost abstract images that is gradually revealed as footage from inside a car going through an automated car wash. That sets up an interesting tension between the seduction of imagery, produced by very high production values, and the observational mode of a kind of a quasi-documentary practice. It's like you're photographing things or filming events as opposed to constructing the events for film. It kind of felt that had that kind of aesthetic. The majority of the film records actions or performances conducted within the public realm, which are in and of themselves can be seen as the artworks. You know, the actual interventions into those public spaces, as much as the actual structure of the film and the installation of the work that you see in this room. The performances, for me, raise questions around the erosion and maybe even the complete abandonment of the public sphere. I'm thinking here about the public sphere as theorized by Jürgen Habermas, who describes a theoretical public sphere as a place where participants must adhere to certain sort of performative rules to, and I quote, insulate this discursive space from the coercion and inequality that constrain human communication in normal everyday life. So this, according to Habermas, affords an equitable position for each participant from which to speak, to voice their opinions, state their objections, and creating in the process a heightened sense of solidarity, and in a sense to build consensus. It's what modern democratic politics is based on. So the establishment and maintenance of an equitable public sphere is crucial actually to the stability of the social fabric. That's one of the arguments. Now, of course, this supposed equality is supposed to be enacted through the institutions that facilitate, for example, political structures, like democratic political structures and an independent legal system. But of course, the theorized public sphere can only ever be an ideal. But it's also important to note that ideals are very dangerous, I think. All sorts of discriminations, oppressions, and abuses have been performed under the guise of an already achieved supposed ideal state, from the civilizing actions of the colonial powers to the supposed democratizing actions of the US-led coalition for the invasion of Iraq, for example. So while these ideals, I think, are laudable, to assume that we've reached there, I think, is equally dangerous. Now, the hypocritical abuses of lofty ideals are also abuses of language. They empty language of meaning, thus undermining, I think, an ability to communicate with any kind of sense of integrity or honesty. And this inability to communicate further erodes any recognition of equality through separation and mistrust. If we can talk to each other, it's based on an already assumed equality because we can understand each other. The erosion of the public sphere and the abuse of language, I think, is most effectively played out in two parts of the film. The interior of the car in the car wash is further revealed to be a large black stretch Humvee, a ridiculous vehicle. I mean, We talk about hyperbole, and that is the manifestation of that. It's insane. With blacked out windows that heads out through an American urban space, but a very particular urban space. The symbolic spaces of equality that are supposed to be maintain the public sphere are also mirrored by our own everyday understanding of physical public spaces. How we encounter each other in public is normally marked by a degree of civility and that at some level recognizes each other's humanity. But if you look at the film and you look at the streets and the public spaces of this particular American city, which I think is Houston, and you'll find that not only in America, of course, but across a lot of the Western world, that these streets, the public spaces, have been abandoned, completely abandoned, only really to the poorest, equally abandoned members of society. The more wealthy majority members of society don't move through these spaces as human beings anymore. The more wealthy members of society enter into this public sphere, and certainly in this film, now more commonly encased in aggressively expensive, exclusive vehicles. Indeed, in this film, this vehicle was originally designed for military purposes. I mean, you couldn't get much more aggressive. So within this scene, this very obviously wealthy woman within the Humvee sits therefore on padded seats behind tinted windows, affording her a very unequal gaze in which she and us as viewers can see the poverty and disregard the individual. The people on the street can see not only the declaration of greed written on the Humvee, but the declaration of purchasing power that they don't have. And therefore, the role of the megaphone is therefore not an effort to communicate, but further a declaration of superiority. So the disappearance of a genuine public sphere is also seen in the footage from the shopping centre, filmed here in Tallaght, which, like all shopping malls, seeks to perpetuate the illusion of a public sphere. That is, in fact, of course, entirely privatized space, policed by security guards and designed to perpetuate excessive and unnecessary consumption. The performances conducted in these spaces, I think, is really interesting. Both the operatic singer and the children's choir state in very bold language the realities of capitalist-driven greed, inequality, and vacuous consumption. But I was really intrigued to under why, just from initial watching, why to do so in that sort of operatic voice, why, in a sense, to be deliberately obtuse. The operatic scores seem to be deliberately dissonant, deliberately hard to listen to. They seemed composed and designed to deliver, again, I think, and I'm probably wrong in this, but an inconsequential effect, which I don't damn, which I'll come back to. There is with much of the film, there's no expectation that these declarations will be heard, actually, or understood with the possibility of an immediate effect on the unsuspecting public. There's no recognition from the public who encounter these performances of the messages that have been masked or delivered through the operatic scores. In my mind, inconsequential performance of protest is further emphasized in the scenes of the African-American Black Panther protesters, which you can see around the walls here, that conclude the first part of the film. The coordinated costumes, the placards of the protesters who file past, I think, in very neat, mute single file, almost seems somewhat like a pastiche. I don't want to say pathetic, but kind of. But it was interesting because I didn't write it off, but it reminded me of my own experience, actually, of demonstrating, for example, against the war in Iraq, which for me, mass protest and holding placards and shouting at the time felt performative. It felt pointless, actually, if I'm completely honest, at the time, even though I enacted those things. The final part of the film that is set at a lavish dinner party held in a high-rise in the Doncaster Hotel, in the centre of London, a dinner party for people who most benefit from this capitalist system. Once again, the brutal celebration of oppression and inequality is delivered in a dissonant operatic score. However, the film here also departs from the observational mode of the other parts and gives way to a more obviously constructed scene. The shift in aesthetic marks also the fact that for the first, last, and only time, the operatic declaration is heard and responded to, specifically by the maitre d', whose job is to politely serve the dinner guests, Importantly, the maitre d' responds in the same language and operatic mode, claiming her own humanity and warning of actions to come. Although, once again, within the film, there's no obvious recognition that her words had any impact, that the privileged dinner guests heard what this woman had to say. As I've said at the beginning, if we see this just purely as a piece of film with a recognizable narrative, the deliberate sort of obtuse operatic delivery and series of inconsequential actions are a problem. There is no resolution offered, no satisfactory outcome to be had. It's frustrating. However, the actual confusion and frustration that is, for me, actually at the heart of the work. And if we see this film within the context of an artwork, then I think there's a much greater range of possibilities that can be opened up. And that's much more about the space within which we see these things as well. For this, I turn to the writings of Jacques Rancière, a French philosopher, and in particular his identification of contemporary artworks operating within what he calls an aesthetic regime. So I have to remember what I'm trying to say. The formation of a space within which I think contesting narratives can be articulated, can be considered using Rancière's conception of the aesthetic regime. It's a notion he uses to describe more socially relevant, discursive framework for art practices. Indeed, Rancière argues that many contemporary artists no longer set out to create works of art. Instead, they want to get out of the museum and induce altercations or alterations in the space of everyday life, generating new forms of relations. The aesthetic regime is understood to support art practices that seek to break links between language and meaning, and to disrupt the relationship between articulation and reception. The ideal artwork within this aesthetic regime creates what he calls heterologies. Rancière quote here, he says, "The dream of a suitable political work of art is in fact the dream of disrupting the relationship between the visible, the sayable, and the thinkable, without having to use the terms of a message as a vehicle." So the function of an artwork within the regime is to offer a different perspective by challenging assumed positions and hierarchies, or to disrupt or rupture the distribution of our established sort of sensibilities, how we understand the world. The most important aspect of artworks within the aesthetic regime is that the effect, and this is really important, the effect of these ruptures can never be predetermined. I said at the start that, does the film have a message? I think actually the fact that if it tried to have a message, I think would miss the point. Because as Rancière states, the artwork, that art cannot work as a simple form of a meaningful spectacle that would lead to an awareness of the state of the world. Within Rancière's aesthetic regime, successful artworks operate within a paradox that he describes as, and again I quote, always the object of a negotiation between opposites, between the readability of the message that threatens to destroy the sensible form of art, and the radical uncanniness that threatens to destroy all political meaning. So while there's an essential indeterminacy to the political orientation or outcome for the encounter between the artwork and the audience, the relationship between aesthetics and politics, I think, is maintained. The indeterminacy created by this disruption that an artwork like this can offer is an invitation or indeed a challenge for the viewer, for us, to redistribute our sensible world from these ruptured fragments. This affords, I think, us a much more essentially active and indeed creative role within the encounter, providing a much more nuanced and I think practical relationship with art and its potential for social agency. But this requires that we recover the spaces of art institutions as places such as this for debate, for actual activity. This is an active space. So we have so many assumptions where art places are sort of quiet places where you stand in front of art and let the genius wash over you. I think that's kind of missing the point. So to collectively redistribute our understanding of the sensible world through consideration of the questions raised by films and artworks such as this, and actually just to seek our own, I think, very much imperfect answers. And I've really enjoyed the project space, for example, in particular in the back. And it's great to see people taking the ideas and making new material based on these ideas. So, of course, I'm sure you guessed from my speech, that I, for one, don't believe in the end of history proclaimed by the wealthy protagonists of the film. The reclamation of a genuinely open public sphere in this instance is analogous to Rancière's aesthetic regime, and that both seek to disrupt the distribution of the sensible without establishing a pre-established outcome. As Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, state, a fully functioning democratic society is not one in which all antagonisms have disappeared, but one in which new political frontiers are constantly being drawn and brought into debate. Thank you very much.
There's a lot that I would like to, because you're bringing so many ideas to the table. But if you don't mind, we're going to move to Emma's presentation now, because I know that you picked on some similar points as well. So we have a transition then.
Yeah, thankfully not too similar, but I'm also talking about Rancière. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the starting point to my response to order, which I'm specifically again going to talk about, is the concept of democracy and the role artworks like Order can play in its radicalization or its expansion. So I'm going to touch on two related concepts, both of which I argue are present in Order, namely Rancière's understanding of dissensus and what Dave Beach and John Roberts call the concept of the Philistine. So, and I will elaborate on what I mean by those in a minute. So before I discuss how I think Order might foment a radicalization or expansion of democracy, I want to briefly talk about the concept of actually existing democracy and its codependent relationship with our late capitalist society. And I'm guessing that we're probably all on the same page here when I say that within the West, democracy, insofar as it purports to describe a state of political, social, and economic equality, remains unrealized. Now, we can trace the origins of democracy to ancient Greece, when members of the demos, namely those who had no place in the social hierarchy, demanded equality with the ruling elite. While the term means the rule of the people, from its infancy, it's been taken to mean the rule of the best people, and we can read the rich and powerful here. So the concept of democracy, as it originated in ancient Greece, was based on a lie. It was a claim of equality in a fundamentally unequal society. And today, the term continues to reinscribe this distinction between the minority elite in power and the majority they purportedly represent. Immanuel Wallerstein points to another issue which prevents the universalization of democracy. Simply that it's not compatible with capitalist accumulation. Any incremental increase in democratic concessions for the masses entails a corresponding decrease in the wealth and power of the ruling classes. So a truly egalitarian democracy remains an elusive concept. And it's precisely these inequalities of our actually existing democracy that act as a catalyst and subject matter for projects like Democracia's Order. So through its staged antagonistic situations and the dissemination of intentionally inflammatory slogans like government is death, harm the board, kill the poor, Order seeks to disrupt the hegemony of actually existing democracy by opening up these spaces of dissensus or disagreement that reveal the antagonisms it seeks to conceal or obscure, as you said already. So I think it does this very successfully. There are lots of moments, such, for example, as the open carry demonstration by the new Black Panthers, and inflammatory statements from both sides of the class divide, when Order succeeds in unnerving and riling both its participants, its onlookers in the public realm, and its final audience in the gallery. And in the process, it manages to divide opinion and to create the conditions for discussion, debate, dispute, and protest that shape the public sphere. Now, Rancière defines dissensus as the moment of challenging the authority and legitimacy of the consensual political order of the state. This challenge necessarily comes from below, from the demos, from those who have no place in the political order. They challenge their exclusion from it, and they demand to be recognised. Rancière then sees the census as real politics, whereas the politics of what he calls the polis, or the police order, namely those who govern society, is undemocratic, in that it serves to exclude those that would resist replicating the consensual order that it upholds. And just as Rancière understands the demos as a necessarily constituent element of the political, Beach and Roberts argue that the Philistine, namely the uncultured individual who has no understanding of or regard for art or culture, forms an equally vital constituent element of a radically democratic culture. The Philistine, then, is a figure that highlights the divisions inherent in the art system by virtue of being absent from it. She or he points to its class-based, its elitist, and its exclusionary composition. It follows then that the inclusion of the Philistine is a necessary component of any critical political art practice, like Democracia's, that acknowledges and attempts to overcome cultural and class-based divisions, as opposed to obfuscating them in a false consensus. So, in order, I would argue that the figure of the Philistine offers a counterbalance to the elite protagonists portrayed in the film, and also to the art world insiders. The Philistine is variously embodied by the shoppers in the square in Tala, the homeless on the streets of Houston, the waiting staff at the Dorchester, and, to quote, all those miserable beings that felt the need to eat, that the tycoon character at the Dorchester sings about so scathingly. And there's a further dimension to the figure of the Philistine that I think is worth mentioning here. Like the proletariat, she or he has political agency when pitted against the bourgeois class of culture. Beach and Roberts argue that Marx's claim for the universality of the proletariat, a claim that was not based on any special ability, but on their negative position within capitalism, can equally be applied to the Philistine. Neither the proletariat nor the Philistine have any special abilities. They both exist at the margins of society. They are both uneducated and are both the antithesis of the bourgeoisie. So, like the proletariat, the Philistine is a political name around which those who do not possess the requisite cultural capital to be part of the art system can coalesce and form a collective will in solidarity with sympathetic art world insiders. And this, I would argue at least, is the goal of what I think Democracia are working towards. Specifically when they state, and this is a quote that I've taken from the interview you did in the publication that accompanies this, that social change is not going to be the result of any artistic practice. But, and another quote from you, art is a tool that can be put at the service of movements that seek social transformation. End quote. So that's my take.
Right. Well, I'm very happy that we have these two very theoretical responses, first of all, because I'm going to stay very close to the actual film, because I was asked to unpack this film opera in terms of the image and sound, how it actually does all those things that we just mentioned in terms of the staging. So as it begins with this very mysterious almost collage of different textures and colors that we don't really understand first, that it's a car wash. There is a throbbing sound in the background. It's a shame that it's almost here. We have only the silent images, but I hope you can follow my imagination. So the throbbing sound is just pervasive, and it keeps on coming at various points throughout the film, which I would call it the film for here. But it is actually, of course, very much an opera. I should state that at the outset, because it uses
some of the very traditional elements from an opera, such as the 3 acts, and there is a diva at the end, and it is a dramatic kind of setting, and there is a dark and apocalyptic almost environment and sound. And so this throbbing sound at the beginning kind of accompanies this epic vehicle that drives through the streets at night, through this tunnel. And the very first time we get to hear not electronically manipulated sounds, but orchestral, what I would say in the style of late Romantic period composition, is when we see actually that loudspeaker. And it looks like a horn that announces a kind of a beginning of a battle. A battle that is about to begin on these streets, and the battle is in that vehicle, bringing with it a particular kind of message. Then it drives through the streets at night, and it's very quickly the day, but the person who's sitting there, we don't really first perhaps make the connection that the sound will come actually from the inside. And we actually, as the audience who watch the film, are the only people who can see that woman. For the people outside on the streets, she is an acousmatic voice. She is a voice with no representation, no visual representation. And that's an interesting point. Perhaps those messages with no responsibility, no responsibility taken in that sense. And there's only one point that perhaps someone could have seen it, but we don't see, when she lowers the window to actually look at the statue of George Bush, late father, with his message. And she looks, and from where I suppose you took the name order from the quote. And it is only then that her face is revealed. We only see the responses of the people. I mean, this is the whole first act and the second. It's very much about constantly dancing between looking and listening to the performance and the responses of the audiences. And they remain silent throughout, except from in the third act, of course, when there is a very clear clapping at the end of the performance of the recitative of the man performing the speech. But sometimes the sound accompanying that melodic, actually, composition is very much almost it's very, very dramatic, and it's almost reminded me a bit of gloomy, spooky movies when you see something spooky is about to happen, and thum thum thum, because when you enter this place of the high skyscrapers, there's a very kind of tense music that prepares you that something evil lives here, something very. So there's a lot of staging in that sense that almost kind of sets the tone for what is about to happen in terms of the meaning of what kind of architecture and what this architecture actually stands for. And when it flips on the other side, when we see the world turn on its head in the first act, and we see the demonstrators, the audience for that demonstration, I believe, are vehicles. Again, you mentioned vehicles. That's interesting. We do not actually see people watching this demonstration. And their signs are silent at first. They're silent to us because we do not see their the messages on those signs, but they're also silent in terms of we only hear the echoes, I would say computer manipulated, the voices. They're only we only hear some of the words perhaps, but mostly it's like, again, a throbbing overall hum of voices that kind of hovers above that imagery of people walking the streets. it would have been nice if it was just going with my speech. So that's the first act. In the second act, that was, I mean, a piece is, I would say, successful. It reaches something if it makes you feel actually uncomfortable in some way. And for me, that part felt particularly uncomfortable because of the text. The text is difficult in all parts, but it's delivered by these children, and they're quite well. They're children. No more needs to be said. So the moral aspects of that were actually quite interesting, and they're singing at the top of their ranges as well. And this juxtaposition between their them being children, singing the top of their ranges, the lyrics being again very dark, apocalyptic, and they're singing in major key, which is associated with happiness and joy and hope, but at the same time also again in war and marches that would be used major key. So a couple of tensions even within one soundtrack of a piece, I would say. References, of course, to the Greek drama with them being one person responding and the choir position in a different kind of space. Again, the audience who just, we only see the responses of being stunned, maybe shocked, not noticing, oblivion, but they're all silent to us. So a kind of a sense of inaction perhaps, or really not non-responsive in a way. And then in the third piece, there is an interesting play between diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. So sounds for which we see the visual representation, so such as cutlery, just banging glasses. So we hear them, but kind of almost isolated in space. And at the same time, there's a piano melody in the background. But what is very, very interesting is that we see shots of the man speaking recitative. When we listen to him in the room, there's a complete silence in the background. I mean, hearing is associated with obedience. It comes etymologically connected. So when you hear zuhören in German, it's etymologically connected to Gehorsam, which is obedience. So there's a power relation of listening and hearing. So there is a complete silence and thus obedience to what the person is saying. But when there is a shot outside, I don't know if you remember, excuse me, looking at the man, looking from the outside, again, there is this throbbing sound. We only hear his voice through that sound, and it's almost like creating an environment of brewing battle, brewing some kind of storm, uneasiness, maybe something that is about to happen, but is not happening yet. A kind of, perhaps, potential revolution, but is not happening yet. So for me, that from that shot from inside and outside was very, very interesting staging. And then, of course, the conversation between them, which is not a conversation at all, but a response. And not a dialogue, but is a dialogue. And so when the diva, the woman at the end, enters and there is no clapping at the end to her performance, and again, the role of silence is quite incredible. I think the very final thing what you hear is again the chatter in the room, so almost going back to normality after hearing those very powerful lines. This is a kind of an overview. I hope that was a bit helpful in terms of I prepared notes, but I didn't look at them.
No, No, thank you so much. That was you really like guided me through the work again, like through your eyes, and I really enjoyed that journey, eyes and ears. I will try to pick up on some of the things that were said and give the voice to the artist because I want you to be very much part of the conversation. And I don't know whether there's something that you would like to say just from what responding to what you heard. But I was also thinking that it would be good for you to say why you decided to do an opera and how it come together, how it was written, who wrote it, and it's a bit of insight.
Well, at the beginning of the project, it was the third act, so it was. It was about talking to the power, the rich people who benefit from the system, and the use of opera was mainly about a strategy, just about using a grammar, a cultural grammar that might be better accepted by the rich and the powerful, so we might have more chances of keep talking and enter the place.
Mm-hmm. Enter the place of rich people's place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So mainly that was.
So the first idea was to start with this third act, like you said, and do an intervention at a dinner or a place that is reserved for, and then it grew from there.
And then that got the opera into the project, and then we developed the rest.
Mm-hmm. And who wrote because it's all written by, it's all original. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the writer is my father.
And your father is also engaged in political.
He used to. Now, he's more devoted to enjoy the life. And, he used to. At some point, he just quit. And so, I mean, the libretto is kind of a gift also from him, and he never thought that we finally could reach this project to an end or accomplish it. We just thought, well, it's going to be impossible. I mean, kind of, it's overwhelming. So he just wrote it without thinking about that it was finally being performed.
And it's been mentioned a couple of times. I think Liam said that it's difficult to listen to it at some point. I think we see this moment in the film when she's getting so high with her voice that you kind of have this reaction. Was that intentional to?
Yeah. Well, there is also to do with the system we work. We collaborate with, in this case, with musicians and composers, and they actually have a really input. So it's not about just us directing what we, but it's about also them proposing. And yeah, it was important. It was in totally purpose from the composer to be at the top of the range, as you said, and there was also a discussion in between the composers and the singers, because it was so high that the singers had difficulties to get there. But yeah, all, especially Act 1 and the second act, the kids is really high, and it was intentional, completely intentional.
And could you help us also understand the title of the work? Because we just saw there's a moment where there's a close-up of a monument of George W. Bush, and there's a quote from him.
Yeah, that's the clue. Yeah, I mean, it makes reference to that.
Yeah, but it's a complicated reference because where do I have it? It says that. Until now, the word we have known has been a word divided, a word of barbed wire, a concrete blob, conflict, and Cold War. Now we can see a new word coming into view, a word in which there is a very real possibility of the new order. But the problem with this quote is that I think it was a speech that he has given in the context of the Gulf War and involvement of Allied forces and Soviet Union. So why did you decide to take that as a starting point?
But in a way, the whole project is about proclaiming a new era that is already there, and it's just taking this new world order. And we do like that also the reference is on the past, because we are talking more from the present, from the facts that, and in that sense I think it just link about with some of the Lian speech that's the reason why also we don't want to include response that. We also want to point out that the silence that is on. There is no solution. It's everything done. And that is more lucky, I think, for the project, because sometimes there are things that come in there and are not really scheduled. That in fact there were plenty of silence in the actions. In fact, Houston was an empty city. Sometimes you had the impression that there was nobody there. You're just doing the action for nobody. And that was powerful also. And here in the square, the contrast was the contrary. It was so noise there that communication was impossible. Most of the people wasn't aware of. I mean, it was the other way around. It was the amount of noise.
Where was that, sorry?
In the square, in the Tala. Yeah, here. Right. So there were also lack of reactions because of an impossibility of communicate there. In fact, you know. And that is a constant, I think, the impossibility of communicate via a language, a speech, or even though if it's a common language. Lisa is also has experienced this impossibility, or maybe the words. So.
Liam, I had an impression that although you were critical of, like you were talking about lack of consequence, and but at the same time, I have an impression that you really appreciate this
very much so.
Work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that it's frustrating is actually possibly one of its greatest qualities. I think the fact that it actually does challenge you, it doesn't present you with any kind of easy solutions, and you have to come up with it yourself, I think. But that's the difference between when you're sitting watching it, as I did when I initially watched it just on a screen, and yes. So you're kind of set up to sit and watch a piece of film out of context. That feels very jarring at first, but seeing it in a context like this, I think it's a lot more effective in that way. But I want to say effective without any, as I said, any predetermined outcome, and that deliberate, that sort of antagonistic aspect of the sound, of that sort of high range, and even something like these protesters here, you know, it wasn't that I'm confronted with their ineffectual actions. I was confronted with my own, and I think that's interesting. So what it challenges me to do is to to think about, can we use spaces initially in the first instance as a proper space for debate, for discussion? But then also that, to be told in no uncertain terms that the political system is not a system. Well, if it's a system, it's a rigged system. That you have to come up with your own answers. So that, in a sense, I start off talking about what I saw as the kind of deliberate sort of inconsequential nature of the structure of the film, but I actually saw that as something that leaves it up to me to figure out things for myself, which I think is more powerful.
And I was curious about what you thought about the depiction of Tala in this film, because it was very interesting what you just said about impossibility of communication. But because what I was struck by when I started thinking about why it was set in a shopping mall and what happened in this space in Tala, like over the last 20 years. I know that you have something to say about that.
Yeah. Well, I suppose this gallery here in Tala.
Yes, but what kind of space are we meeting in right now? And what is the possibility of political action here or communication?
Well, I think just a gallery located in a region this is sort of outside of the sort of centre of a capital city like Dublin affords, I think, potential encounters that are unexpected. I think because you've got to have a different demographic, and I'm a perfect example of that. It happened to me. This is 19. I grew up in a housing estate on the edge of Belfast. And walked into an art gallery and saw video work by Willie Doherty, and it just rewired my head in an instant, and it took me 10 years to figure out what it was. But in a very similar fashion to this film, it confronted me with my own prejudices, and then I had to go away and think about that. But in fact, the fact that it's Tala, I think, is more important for the gallery than for the film, because when I first saw the film, I assumed it was America. For ages, until I saw O'Brien's Sandwich Bar. And I went, oh my God, it's Dublin, it's Tala, it's the square Tala. And I think that was very interesting, that actually that shopping centre could actually just be anywhere. Could be anywhere. Any shopping mall, they're all designed around the same parameters to do the same thing in the same mode, usually with the same shops. But so for me, that the fact that it's Tala is important for here, because it gives a connection to people and the way in it stops. It's like a bridge into a space like this, because I know, for example, for myself, I wouldn't have gone into galleries because I thought it would have been thrown out. For a long time, I was sort of waiting for somebody to kick me out of these places because I didn't belong. But so I think that's interesting in the context of this gallery.
And do you have so, because what I was struck by is this use of capitalism and retail as a tool of what is called revitalization of the place. I was wondering if you have something to say about that as well.
I think, like Lee was saying there, that it's possibly more important for trying to reimagine what Tala is now, because so many of Dublin suburbs have been born out of this kind of huge cold regeneration processes, gentrification processes, where communities, and I know Tala and Ballymun and spaces like that, are all originally city-centric communities. And in the 80s, the Irish government decided to regenerate the community and or the city centre and push these communities out to the outskirts. And Tala is, as we've discussed in the relationship between Tala and Dublin, Tala is really on the periphery, and Ballymun and it certainly was on the periphery. And when these spaces were originally built, there was no infrastructure. So although they were based on, say, Le Corbusier's city of the future, they were based on these cities without any physical infrastructure for the people living there, so that no shops, no community centres, and they quickly become areas of social disadvantage. So phase 2 of this scheme by the government is to reimagine these spaces, to go back and raise the high-rise towers in Ballymun and to redevelop Tala, and to do this with cultural regeneration this time. So let's put in art centres, these shiny new buildings, and let the money flow in, and the developers flow in and build all these high-rise apartment blocks and squares, as we've seen all around this area. But then the question is, how does that actually address the community? What does that actually do for the community? And for the most part, it means that, you know, the value of property goes up, and, you know, local residents are forced out further, or what sort of real relationship. So for me, you know, this project in this gallery, this relationship with apolitical is a really vital, important thing. But this is something that art centres, you know, need to be doing more of. And it's great that they're kind of taking the lead and doing this. And I suppose the question more is how, you know, when we look around the room today, you know, what is the demographic here, and how many of us are, you know, art world insiders and so forth, and how do we?
I want to say raise your hands, but
yeah, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but yeah, and how do we, you know, kind of really build? And the choir was absolutely brilliant. That's fantastic. And I'm assuming they come from the local choir. Yeah. That's just really, you know, great to have that kind of level of engagement. So projects like that, I think, are crucially important if we want to address this, because otherwise the alternative option is just, you know, gorging yourself in the shopping centre, consumerism, and, you know, and trying to create this debate outside of it, which you know you do so, you know, brilliantly in this process of kind of really antagonising people and making them feel uncomfortable. And yeah, I felt the same way when I was watching the film as Liam did. There was moments in it where I felt really, really uncomfortable in my own skin, and I really perplexed. And I had all these conversations with colleagues in NCAD, and some of them who really didn't like the film, and some of them who absolutely loved it. And just the kind of the dissonance in their reasons for that, I think, was really, really important. To be able to incite that kind of level of agreement and disagreement is crucial.
Yeah, he definitely does think different in the film, so that's a major thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, it's really kind of hard-hitting opinions about this.
And what was your aim, you know, when you were doing this film? Because I know that you work quite a lot with this idea of hopelessness, of hopelessness, that there's no hope for change, and there's the revolution is really not coming. And I was wondering, what was the aim of the project really? Because Irene suggested it's like almost like not a call for action, but you can feel that the potential of something happening.
Well, I don't know if we have a clear aim for this project. Well, if there is an aim, we must to say that if we go to the bone of Democracia's frame of work, for us it's very important propaganda. We are working on propaganda. Maybe it's more sophisticated, like this video installation. Maybe it's more literally, as we can see at the serigraphy workshop. And at least, well, we have at the Act 3 one individual, one woman confronting those in power and sending a message. Maybe this is not time for revolution, but we must to keep a fire, just to say. When Lion says that there is no transformation in the work, we totally agree. As we state, as you remark, we don't believe in an art can. In an art could be transformative, because art by itself is not enough. We can go, for example, to the 80s, to Grand Fury, when they were fighting against the government about the ICE issues and so on, and they made a very powerful work on propaganda, on awareness the people. On aware the people, and he said, art is not enough. We need direct action. And for us, maybe we need to see that we always are working in two levels. Maybe one level is this level, the level of contemporary art, where we have a code and a way to show. And we have another level of work is directly related to social movements in Madrid, to political movements, mainly libertarian movements. And for us, this kind of saying, okay, maybe it's not the time, but keep going, for us is enough. We don't pretend to transform anything through art. In this point, talking about some points that you said, maybe I can understand you well, but if I am, you can correct me. You were talking about public space as a space to consensus, to dialogue.
Yeah. I mean, Habermas established that. I don't necessarily think that's the right thing, personally.
No. For us, public space is under surveillance continuously. Yeah. It's not that free space. No. It's a space for consensus, but we don't need consensus. We need to show the conflict from our point of view. I think that in some ways it's okay that the work could be frustrating for some viewers. We don't look for a mass accepting of our work, and we appreciate the criticism and so on. Another thing is you talk about Chantal Mouffe, about radical democracy. And for us, it's a difficult issue too, because in Spain, Chantal Mouffe and other people related to radical democracy are always in the speech of the new party, Podemos, which at the beginning it was like a hope for the Spanish political scene, but finally they made up a new party, but it's a social democratic party. It's not really a transformative party, but they are supporting all of their speech and thoughts in radical democracy, in Mouffe, in populism, which is the name of the other theories who used to work with Mouffe. Declan, yeah. They are political reference in Spain right now, in the media, in the speech of Podemos, and we don't see any transformation.
Wow. Yeah.
And I don't know. Maybe we are negative, but we prefer to stand with our speech. Okay, it's not time for hope. It's time of hopelessness. But stay with that idea of utopia or emancipation, and keep going with that. Talking about the Black Panthers, there is no sound on his voices. But we feel that the guns speak for itself, for themselves, too. For us, this kind of, we are on the self-defense is the response to the Humvee. More than the words, more than, because the words in the demo was too black, too strong.
Yeah.
They are black and they are strong, and we can see it. Black power. The other sentence was, "Who are we?" We are Huipi, one of the founders of the original Black Panthers. And that's all.
I think at this point we should open questions from the public. So, do you have any questions? or comments, ideas? Not really. Would you like to respond to what Pablo said?
Yeah, it's kind of depressing that's Ernesto Laclau and Roof are sort of being used, but it's the same thing, I suppose. It's where people use this thing to kind of proclaim an already there, that this is not an aspiration or something that you constantly have to work for. You know, this, if you believe in perhaps maybe naive ideas of equality or a fairer society, perhaps that is, then it's terrible to see even somebody whose ideas is actually about the census, and I agree with you, Emma, about the census being vitally important, to actually deliberately be antagonistic, to challenge people directly, and that is actually where you can create space for disagreement. Is as important as sort of trying to come up with some sort of shared existence.
I think we have to wrap up now, but it was such a pleasure to hear you speak, and thank you so much for joining us for this panel, and thank you for staying with us. And if you have any questions to our guests, don't hesitate to approach them. Thank you again, and that's it from us. Yeah, thank you.